Okay, so it's recording. Welcome to today's tutorial. We'll be going through the 2023 SSA right here, the 2023 SSA, which is a SIG test. So it's about ants, right? So the Utopian Myrmecology Society has been ramping up its study of ant behavior. They have formulated several rules and need to simulate them to determine whether they're accurate and simulate real ant behavior. So basically, this game mimics how the ants actually move or operate. The Myrmecology Society contacted you to help create such a simulation. Oh, so it's a simulation game. Yeah, there's no moving up and down. Yeah, the simulation. I wanted the up and down, but it's fine. We'll do another simulation. The following diagram describes the simulation setup and features. So a lot of students were asking me like, what's the flow? How do you go about starting the question paper and everything? What I would do, right? What I would always advise you to do is you start by identifying the characters in the game. Start there. Keep it simple. So I'm gonna open Notepad plus plus, not Notepad, Notepad plus plus. And then you plan, right? If you remember this plan, yeah, this I still have it. So if you remember this question paper we did here, we planned everything. And that's the exact same thing you're gonna do for your question. So the first step, you look at the game characters we have. So I have ants, right? So that's number one. I have an ant. I won't write it in plural, I'll just write it in singular. We have an empty square, right? So it's up to you what you want to call it. I'll call it empty, right? As you can see, I'm actually also I'm actually solving a lot of things at once. You see the way I'm naming them like this. This is how I'm also going to create the enum. I'll name them exactly like this. And then we have the ant colony entrance, which is a black square. So we have ant colony entrance, right? So we have the ant colony entrance here. And then we have food sources, right? So we have food source, which is not, remember, won't write it in plural, we just say food source, singular. So these are all the game characters. Then now, since I've listed all the game characters, I would advise you to always start with an empty space. Okay, you don't have to, but it's fine. Let me not make you cram. You don't have to start with anything. It's fine. Then after coming up with the ends, with the game features, right, or the game characters that will be involved in your game, each character you give it a symbol that you want it to be represented in a game. So for ends, we're gonna use A. So if we see an A, we see that we know that's an end. And then for empty space, we're typically gonna use dot. So I'm gonna use a dot for that. So I'll put it in single quotes because it'll be a char, right? I'll put it in single quotes because it's gonna be a char. And then let me choose the programming language to be C++. And then end colony entrance, right? So I'll use C. It's up to you. Remember, this is my plan, right? You can plan it in your own way, use different symbols. It doesn't matter. Remember what I said, the output is only worth 5%. Don't stress too much about output. And then food source, I'll just put an F for that. Keep it simple. Then now I need to give integer numeric values for each game character, right? Basically, we always use the number zero for space, empty space, because remember, zero represents an absence of a value, or meaning there's nothing, which is typically the same meaning as an empty space. Because an empty space it means that there's nothing in that location, it's not occupied. So I'll use zero for that. And then for ends, I'll just make it a one. It's up to you. Remember, don't cram my solution. As the if you understand English, I said my solution, not the solution. You can the question paper actually has multiple solutions because people can implement it in their own way. You need to be unique, do it in your own way. So I'll use a 2 for a colony entrance, and then I'll use a 3 for a food source. Then this is my first plan, right? This is the first part I started here, right? Then now I know all the game characters that are involved. I've listed them. So we have food sources, all those things. Yeah. And then I've chosen the symbols that will represent each feature. Then you'll obviously read the background, blah, all these things. But to be honest, what matters is this bullet point here, this paragraph, and everything after it. This just kind of gives you what the basics of the game. It's fine, you can read everything, but the main point, the main area I'm going to focus on is here because we want to be quick as possible with our sessions, right? So they'll tell you that you must place everything inside a namespace, which is called end space. So I'm going to copy that name. I'll actually use that name as the header file or and the CPP files to keep my, I don't want to think too much when I'm coding, right? I just want to use the names that are available for me to use. So when I have to name my header file in my CPP file, I'll just use that name for that namespace because the header file it describes that thing most. Like it's called end space, right? So the header file is called endspace.h. It means that it's about ends, right? So it also makes my application easy to understand. So we're going to create a console application, C++, then name it. You see the name that you put here, right? It's the name that's stated in the in the practical. There should be a naming convention somewhere. They will write it. They'll tell you how to name it. If you yeah, they didn't put it, but they usually put it how you should name your project. So if they do put it, you should name it that way. In my case, they didn't, so gonna name it my own way. So I'm gonna put my company's name first, followed by the module code, and then followed by the what am I doing here? This is a semester test 2, 2023 SSA memo. Yeah, I think this will be enough information. And then I'm going to click on view, then manager, because I want to see this panel. For me, I always remove it because when I'm coding and I'm recording, I don't want to have a small screen. I want it to be full screen. That's why I remove it. So there's the main.cpp. Then I need to create my files. You see the flow, the process I'm following. You should follow the same process. If for those who were asking me how in what order should I answer the semester test, you can follow this order. Then the header file, paste that namespace name, so and put the extension .h because it's a header file. Then click the three dots to include this header file into your project. If you don't click these three dots, it's not gonna run. You can't save it. So be very wary of that. And then I typically like to remove the underscore included. To be honest, it doesn't do anything. It's a preference. So I'm just gonna remove that underscore included. Click all. Don't forget to click all. If you forget, it's not gonna pick up errors. And then click finish. And then there's your header file. If you are on VPL, you need to all of this by head. VPL doesn't give you the option it doesn't include these things for you automatically. So you need to understand which tool you're gonna use when you write semester test 2. Don't use VPL and expect it to work like code blocks. You need to understand which tool you're using. And then CPP file, include it into my project, select all, click finish. And then this is the header file, right? And then the very first thing you need to do, you see that the very first thing before we even go to initialization, they're talking about the namespace. So I need to create a namespace named end space. Remember here, we need to create it, not use it. I don't want to see spiritual things you typing using. No, you're not using it, you're declaring it, you're creating it. So create this namespace. It's called end space, and then put these things inside of that namespace. Because the namespace is sort of like we're defining a toolbox. And then those curly braces, they define what is inside the toolbox, which is the tools, like a screwdriver, a hammer. Yeah, you can. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Well, for the girls out there, you can go Google it. It's not that too difficult. So let's see. Yeah, so one thing, okay, we're not done. Let me also do this. I'll also copy this namespace because I see students tend to forget to copy it. So after creating this namespace, you must also put it in the CPP file because the header file, it serves as a promise to C++. You are promising it that you'll implement all of these functions inside of the namespace. So obviously you said they are inside of the namespace. Even when you implement them, you tell C++ they are declared in which namespace. You're not using it. Remember, you're implementing it. So you can't, there's no using keyword here. And then before you include the namespace, you need to include the header file, right? And space.h. What the header file, remember we talked about preprocessor directives, right? The hash included means go to this file and include everything from that file. So basically it does this. It copies all of the lines that are here. It goes here and then it replaces that preprocessor directive with whatever is inside that header file. So like this. So it includes everything in that header file. Okay, my bad, I didn't copy everything. So let me copy it. Yeah, so and then it replaces here with whatever is in the header file. So like this. So that's why we also need to specify that we declared a namespace. Because when you declare those functions, they're inside a namespace. But the preprocessor does that for us. We don't have to copy and paste automatically, manually, I mean. It'll be done for us automatically. Then now we are done. Then before we, to be honest, you don't need, for this part, right? You don't necessarily need to look at the game at the moment. This part that I'm about to do right now. You only look at the game when you get to that part. The way I'll do it from now on, right? The way, like I said, a lot of you have been asking, what's the flow, what's the process? Like, how do I do it step by step? What I would do in this tutorial, right? We'll start with initialization phase, all of it, and then we finish it step by step, and then we add the next function for the next process, for the next thing we need. Well, I guess we'll do it in that way. But I feel like there's really no format. You just write in you always write from start to bottom, right? You start the initialization, then you go down to simulation phase, then you go down to end simulation. You just do it by order, in order, right? The thing is, we even though we're doing it in order, there's some functions that we might need to solve those other functions. For example, we might need a convert to integer function, something like that. Obviously, that's not stated in the question paper. You just need to know that. So that's why I don't see a process like you start here, you go there. I don't see it. I forgot to mention something. The thing is, sometimes code blocks C++ works even though you don't include some header files. Those functions about to lower and to upper, they're actually inside the CC type header file. I keep forgetting to include it. So here now you include all the header files you need. So we need the two. Okay, we might not need it here. Let me not include it here. It's fine. You can still include it here. There's no problem. But you're actually gonna use it here, right? Remember. So I'm gonna include it here. So I'm gonna remove CC type. I'm gonna start with the ctime library because we need to generate random numbers. Then I'm gonna need the cstdlib because we need that exit function, right? Then I'm gonna include the string type because we need to pass a string as a parameter in that convert to integer function. Then we need to include the string stream stream, which is the header file whereby we're going to use we're gonna use a type or a data type from that header file in order to implement the convert to int function. And then what else do I need? IO stream because we're gonna be printing. So hash include IO stream. We're gonna use cout and cout, right? Yeah. Remember, we're gonna have display function. So we're gonna need to use cout. And then what else do I need? Yeah, I think so far this is what I'm seeing. If I remember something else, I'll edit. Um, let's see. So yeah, then the next step is to declare me the way it's always I always do it in this flow. I'm sure you've noticed. I start declaring the array itself, right? So we need to use what I call type def. I did talk about it. Go watch the recording if you haven't, which means that you basically you rename a data type. We call that new name that you have that you are declaring. We call that the alias, meaning sort of like a synonym for that type. So instead of using this type, you can use that name, which means this type. So we're gonna say type def, start with a one-dimensional array. Remember, each pointer represents a dimension. So I want to represent a one-dimensional array. So that's why I'm using one pointer here. Then I'm gonna call it 1D array because it's one-dimensional array. It represents a one-dimensional array. Then I'm gonna declare another type def, but then for 2D. So int pointer because it's two-dimensional, right? It's 2D. But we've already said that whenever you see this, you can replace it with this name. Where do I see it? There it is here. So I can replace that part over here with that name 1D array. And C++ will simply replace 1D array with this over here. So in a way, you're just making your code more readable so that another person who reads your code, even if he's not doing computer science, he can understand what you're trying to do in your code. So I'm gonna call this type 2D array. And remember, C++ is very strict. You see how I name where I put the capitalization inside of each of these words. They need to match even when you're passing it as a parameter. You put in the wrong case, maybe 2D array, you see starts with the capital T, and then you start with the small letter T. C++ will complain. You say, I don't know it. So that's why it's actually very imperative. It's very important that you understand computers are not your friend. They are very strict. They are very logical. So you need to make sure you answer you need to make sure that you type in the data type's name exactly the way you've declared it. You see here it starts with a capital O and it is a capital D and a capital A. If you change them for some weird reason, C++ was not gonna think it exists. It will think it doesn't exist. So be very careful of that. Me, I have experience, so that's why most of the time when I write my code, I barely get errors. When I get errors, I know how to fix them. I've been coding since 2019. So you don't compare yourself to me. Yeah, it's your first time. Yeah. So let's see. So we have our array, right? So these are two different arrays, right? Remember, a two-dimensional array is is basically a one-dimensional array with at each index you have a one-dimensional array. So I hope that makes sense. That's 2D. If you really want to understand the 2D part, I'd advise you open your calculus textbook. Go to somewhere, there's a page where it talks about the dimension somewhere in the calculus textbook. Because remember, computer science is based on mathematics. So if you understand maths, even actually we have things called functions. Don't you have functions in maths? We do. We have sequences. We can create something that outputs a series. Don't we have sequences and series in maths? We do. So everything that's in code, it's similar to maths. Most of the concept they borrowed them from maths. So I have my 2D array, and then remember we planned over here. We said that we're gonna have and there's going to be an empty space, meaning nothing is in that location. Basically, that location is not occupied. And then we're going to have what we call an ant colony entrance. Then we're going to have what we call a food source. And we planned that for each of these game characters, we'll use these symbols for each of those characters. And in terms of integer representation, we're going to represent it with these numbers that we wrote here. So now I need to plan that. Remember, they taught you guys about enums. Enums are very good in one thing. Let me show you why, right? What I'm going to do, remember I said the way I've named these features, I was actually planning in advance how I'm going to create the constants. Because remember, we have constants for characters, we have constants for integers, right? So let's start with the constants for integers. I won't use an enum. I'll show you. I'll start with declaring them as a constants, then convert to an enum so that you see the difference or the benefits in a way. So let's declare our game feature. Game feature. Whoever is this mic unmuted, please mute. So we're gonna have game features integer constants. Right. So remember how to declare constant. You start by the keyword const because it's constant. It's not going to change. So const followed by the type const int. Then we have number one, our int. We say that's going to be represented by one. Then we have const int empty space. I'll just call it empty. We say that's represented by zero. Then const int int colony entrance. That's a very long name. Int colony entrance. Wait, where is it? Int colony entrance. So entrance. We said that's gonna be a 2, right? Yeah, we said that's gonna be integer number 2. And then const int what's the other one? Food source, which will be a 3. So food source, which will be the integer number 3. Okay, there's nothing wrong with this, to be honest. It's just a matter of preference. You just remember your game still works without enums and record structures. It still works. It's just a matter of preference. I'd advise you to check that video I talked about where I said you should go if you want to understand record structures better. I would advise you check that video. I explained it way, way better there. So we have this concept, right? There's a thing called an enum, whereby the enum word, right, it stands for enumerate, meaning give these variables numbers, right? Enumerate them. So you start by putting the keyword enum, which comes from the word enumerate, followed by the name of that enum. So basically, you can look, in order to come up with the name of the enum, you must understand what I'm trying to represent. I'm trying to represent a game feature. So I'm going to call this enum game feature because it represents my game feature. And the way enums work, right? They start the first name you put in there. And remember, enum is a collection of constants. So everything you put here, right, in between this curly brace and this curly brace, all of them are constants. That's why I created constants first so that you understand it. So this is the way enum works, right? Like I said, the first constant you put in, right? Let's say you put in x. It starts being 0. It starts at 0. And then to add another one, you just put a comma. And then after the comma, you add the next constant. Then what C++ does, right, is that the constant after, it takes the value of the previous constants and adds 1 to get the value of the current constant. So let's say y here. So y takes the value of x plus 1. What is x is 0, right? So 0 plus 1 just gives you 1. So y becomes 1. And then if you say comma again, you add z. Z becomes, what is the previous constant? It's y, which is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. So it does it like that. Even if you still give it a starting point. Remember, by default, it starts at 0. If you give it a starting point, let's say you say it starts at minus 1, it still adds 1. The only difference is that it starts at minus 1. So if it starts at minus 1, this y would be minus 1 plus 1 because it always adds 1. So y would become 0. So yeah, so since we want it to be starting from 0 and it gives them numbers in the order that you passed them, right? So that's why I'm gonna start by passing the empty. So I'm doing this right so that you understand the enums. Like I said, it's a bunch of constants, but then the benefits of an enum, right? You omit const ints. And another thing, right? Enum only const ints, right? Not const double, const float. No, only const ints are allowed in an enum. So an enum's benefits is that you remove const ints. No, they are no longer needed. And then you don't end with semicolon. You separate each constant with a comma. So comma, comma. And then the last, if there's when you reach the last constant, you don't add a comma because there's no constant after the last one. And this the order is wrong. Remember what you talked about. It starts counting from zero. So I want end to be one. So I'm gonna copy this and edit after empty space, then comma. But then, like I said, enums are very advanced. You don't have to initialize, you don't have to give it initial values, especially if you know that they go in the order that you want it to be. So there's no need to specify your starting point. So I'll just simply remove the equals to. You see how much better it is than this. It doesn't stop your game from working. It still works the same way. You can still initialize to empty space at row R column C. It's still fine, but it's just a bit convenient now. It's a bit better. So that's what I wanted to show you here. So I'll just stick to enum. So yeah, we're not done yet. So we have our constants, right? We use the exact same names. You see that I use the exact same names and the exact same values. Then now I need to create my array with the symbols. So I need an array. It's gonna be they're constant, meaning they'll never change. So I'm gonna use constant, and each symbol in my array. Remember, array is made up of values or multiple variables of the same type. So it's as you can see, all of these are of type what? Char. They are all characters. So const char, the constant array will be called game feature. And I want you to understand something. Remember what I talked about C++, that it's very picky. It's very it's a perfectionist. This game feature over here, it's taught to C++ is totally different from this game feature over here. Don't get confused. As you can see, this one is all the letters are in are capitalized. So automatically it's different. Plus this one is an underscore. So it's totally different according to C++. So that's why I'm allowed to do that. And then I need to pass in my symbols here. Remember, empty space is zero. To be honest, it's actually easier now because you pass it in this order. Remember, empty is zero. This is 0 plus 1, which is just 1. This is 1 plus 1, which is just 2. This is 2 plus 1, which is just 3. So I need to pass them in that order because funny enough, right? If you remember arrays that they're zero index, so I can actually create an array to represent my characters since each character is an integer value, and then that integer value will act as an index in my array. So obviously the first index 0 is an empty space of which I planned that is going to be a dot, right? And then after index, we have an int, which I planned that I'm going to use the capital letter A. And then colony entrance, I planned that I'm going to use the capital letter C. And then food source, I planned that I'm going to use the capital letter F. And then there's my array of features, right? Then we're done with that. And then what else do we need before we get to the functions? Oh, we also need, yeah, we also need, what is this thing? The enum for the status, right? Meaning as the game, was the game successful? Was there an error in the command line arguments? Because remember, when you call the exit function, you need to pass in integers there. So I'm going to create an enum because all those integers are going to be constants. So I'd rather use an enum instead of always typing const int, const int. So enum, it represents the status of my game. So I'm gonna call it status, or you can write it in full and call it status code. It's up to you. To be honest, this name doesn't get used that much. Only except when when you're trying to say this function takes in something of that represents a status code. That's when this name can be used is used. Other than that, you just use the names of the constants inside the enum. So obviously, I'm gonna have errors in the CMD arguments, right? So I'm gonna have errors in CMD args, comma. I'm gonna have an error in my converting to int, right? So error in conversion. I'm gonna call it in conv. You could write it in full and say conversion because yeah, it's up to you. And then I'm gonna have another one for success, right? Just you don't have to. It's just so remember zero represents success. So instead of outputting returning zero, I'm gonna tell it return success, which is just zero. Like I said, all of these things we're doing is to make your code more readable. To be honest, most of these things are not necessary. It's just to make other people when they read your code, they should understand it better. But remember, we need to return zero. So that means the constant success needs to have an integer value of zero. If enums always add by one, I'll just simply say start at -2 here because I want this success to be zero. So it should be zero now. So that's the enum for my status code. And remember, our game doesn't have move up, move left, move down. So we're not going to have a constant for move up, move down, move left. There's no such thing. There's a simulation. They move on their own. You don't touch them. You just click start simulation and then they all start moving on their own. Even game, whether to represent a win or a loss, it depends. It all happens automatically. That's why it's called a simulation. So when someone says, if you remember that code, I don't know if you've watched the movie The Matrix. They talk about a simulation there. You should watch that movie to understand how a simulation works. Basically, is to create um, a clone, sort of like a clone of the real thing. So to clone that real thing, that's sort of like a simulation. But then that thing you've cloned, it operates on its own. It moves on its own. So since it's moving on its own, we call that a simulation. Yeah, so I hope that makes sense. So I'm also gonna create a record structure here. I don't know why students get confused with the record structure. Let me see. I think it's mandatory for you to use them in the mark sheet. Let me just double check. Oh, there's also marks for assertions. You see, use of assertions. So I need to include the header file for assertions. It's called C assert. So hash include C assert because you're gonna use the assert function from the C library. So that's why it's called C assert. Yeah, if you didn't know, C++ is like the child. There is a parent, which is the programming language that came before C++. C++, it actually extended at another language called C. You can go do your research on that. There's plenty of courses online. So I want to check record structures. They should be mentioned here. Standard namespace. Yeah. So you see all those header files you've included, they're actually worth 3%. So yeah. Even indication of successful termination of program. I'm not sure what exactly they mean that, but I get what they're talking about. Header file. So 1 mark for creating the header file. Saying hash include that header file is also 1 mark. So yeah, you can get out of marks. You see that output is not really important in this question paper. Yeah, structures are worth 5%. So it is actually there. It's worth 5%. It's a must. It's not a bonus. There might be a bonus, but it's separate. You see here, it's a must for you to use them. So you actually need to become more comfortable to it. So I'm gonna call it game world because it represents. I'm gonna store things that represent my game world. Remember, we talked about record structures. For those who are still new, who haven't watched all the recordings, I'd advise you to go catch up and watch all the recordings. So a record structure in simpler terms, right? You remember an array, you can store multiple variables under one name, and then they should be of the same type, meaning it can only be all integers or all doubles or all strings. That's how arrays work. With a record structure, it's the opposite. You can have all those multiple variables, but they can be of different types. So you can include them, mix them. You can have like a salad, mix masala. You have you have ints, you have doubles, floats, chars. You can mix them. So that's why we're using a struct for this, because our game mode is represented by different data types. So what are those data types? We have the first thing, which is our 2D array, which represents our 2D space, game mode, right? So I'll call it array world. You can call it game or whatever you want to call it. Just make sure you use this type. And notice something, the capitalization where it should be, you must put it exactly there because that's what you told C++. C++ is not like human beings whereby remember us as human beings, we can let things slide if you're chatting on WhatsApp, right? You won't be like, show me, why didn't you put a full stop? What's wrong with you? We don't do that, right? We have, I don't know, maybe that's what sets us apart from machines. We have consciousness, right? So computers are not like that. They see something not matching, they're like, hey chief, that's no, I don't let things slide. Yeah, that's wrong. Go fix it. So that's why you need to be you need to be attentive. You need to be a person who pays attention to details. And most of the time, it's people with anxiety, things like that. Those are the people who are very good at paying attention to things because yeah, they spend too much time in their head and think about 20 scenarios all at once. So that means you can pay attention to details. So we have our game mode, right? And our game mode has a size represented by rows and columns. So I'm gonna need to pass in also my rows and columns. And then the game mode, you don't have to be honest, but I will for the sake of it, but you don't have to. You can also create two Boolean variables that represent whether the user has won or lost. But if you understand English, right? If you understand coding, right? Bold, I actually create one variable. I was wrong to create two. Not necessarily, but then like in terms of trying to be a perfectionist, that was wrong. So remember bool, right? It stores whether the user's won or not. Obviously, if it's false, that means the user's lost, right? If it's true, that means the user's won. So I can actually use only one variable here instead of two. So we have has one, we have that. What's next? Let's check the game. Let's read the initialization part because that's the part that tells us what's going to be passed. The number of food sources and the total number of ends are specified using command line arguments. The game should prompt the user to specify the size of the environment. Oh, so we're actually gonna have also the number of food sources. And if you notice something in my record structure, I'm passing most of the time the things that are mentioned under initialization within the first two bullet points under initialization. So I have the food sources, the total number of ends. So number of food sources and number of ends. So int number of food sources and then int number of ends, right? Because that all of this information talks about my game world. So it talks about my game or it represents my game. Yeah, that's pretty much what you needed to pass. Because I mainly look at the two important things, whether you're getting it via the users via the console or via command line arguments. Those are most of the things that are included in my record structure. As you can see, this is all the information that represents a game mode. Then now we can create our functions. Remember, I said we're going to do one by one. I'll stick to that. So we'll start with the easiest function, which is the initial. We're starting with the initialization, right? So we're gonna start with initialization. So initialization needs I think two functions. We'll see. So these are the functions, right? So when you create a game world, that's why you see why it's important to use things like structs to make your code easy to read and understand. You see, there's a game world. So that means my function should return something of type game world because gives you back the game world with its initial conditions or initial settings. So game world, it's up to you what you want to call it. You can call it init world, meaning to initialize world, or alloc memory because you're also allocating memory. Or like I said, don't cram. Understand the logic. So I'm gonna call it create world because it creates the game world. That's the naming convention or the approach of the way I decided to name it. You can name it whatever you want to name it. Then it needs to take in the things that we're getting from the user. And this function, it usually takes all the things we're getting from the user, whether via command line or via console, it doesn't matter. So in this case, we are taking in the size of the environment, which is rows and columns. We also take in the number of food sources and the number of ends. So we need to pass in 4 parameters. So I'm gonna start with the rows. So it's up to you, right? To be honest, it's up to you. I like to be more accurate because I understand C++ a bit deeper. And most people in the industry, they advise you to write it this way. So I know you usually say int rows, that's it, right? Which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Me, I typically like to do it this way. I use address of, but if I pass it by address, that means within the create world function, I can change my rows, which is wrong. You don't want user to keep on changing the game size. Imagine you bought FIFA 2020 to FIFA 25, right? And you're playing FIFA, and then you can resize the game mode to work on a Nokia phone, on a Nokia 3310. Imagine if we could do that. That would be weird, right? You can't allow users to change the game. Only you, the people, the company that released the game, you release it with initial settings, and then you give them some extra settings that they can do, but then with certain limitations, right? In this case, you wouldn't expect the user to change the game mode. So even if I'm passing it by reference because I want to save memory, I'll make it const reference, meaning it still remains constant, even though I have the ability to change these rows. So this const prevents me from changing the rows within the create world function. Then const int calls and then const int number. I said number of ends and number of what? Number of food sources, number of food sources, right? Hey, that's a very long name. Comma const int number of ends. Number of ends. Yeah, I know it's a very long. Yeah, you can, like I said, you don't have to do it my way. You can do it your own way. And then I'm gonna need before we continue creating other functions, right? I'll create the functions that we most probably want to use with this create world function. Yeah, I'll create those functions for now. For example, we want to display our game mode, right? So void display game. Yeah, I would literally call it display game because it displays my game mode. So okay, let me just name it display game mode because it displays the game mode. Then since it displays a game mode, it takes in a game mode because it needs the game mode to display. And you're passing it by reference because you want to save memory, right? But since this function, its only purpose is to display. Yeah, I shouldn't leave it like this. If I leave it like this, I have the ability to change this game mode within this display game mode function, of which I don't. It's only meant to display. So I'm going to put const here to prevent that from happening. And then after display game mode, to create the game mode, remember, we need to also convert to integer the command line arguments. So I need a function that's going to return or give me back an int since it converts an int to an int, right? Since it converts to an int, I'm going to call it convert to int because it converts something to an integer. What does it convert? A string. Remember your command line arguments, right? They're actually an array of strings. So that means I'm going to convert a string. But within here, I don't typically advise you to say using namespace standard because you don't implement here. So you're not going to use it too much, right? So here I'll just simply specify which then a namespace. Basically, remember namespace we said is a toolbox. So when I say std, I'm telling C++ this is the toolbox where it's from. Then I'll specify two colons, which means go inside that toolbox and grab this tool. What tool do I want to grab? The string data type, right? Because this function is you're supposed to pass in a string. And then that string it represents our value, right? So call it value, which is the string that we get from the command line, right? And then one last function, right? Just to be sure, because remember, since you can create the game mode, you can also destroy it, right? Once you're done, it's like cleaning the plate after eating. You need to clean, right? Once you're done using it. So and it doesn't return anything, right? So void, I'm gonna call it destroy game mode because we're done using it, right? Using our array, basically working with our game mode, we're done with it. And since I want to destroy a game world, I'm going to take in a game world. And since I want to destroy it, you see the word destroy, that means I'm changing it. So I'm going to pass it by address, by reference, and then record. And I won't put the const here because I actually want to change it. So I don't want to be prevented from changing it. Then these are the first four functions that I'll say they are needed for, especially if you want to also see your output. If you don't want to see your output, it's fine. Functions like display, you can leave them for later. In this case, I want to do initialization, but I need all those functions because I also want to see my output. So once you're done, right, remember these are only function prototypes. Basically, you promise C++ that you provide implementation. Now you need to implement them. So I'm going to copy all of them, right click, choose copy. And then don't also forget to save every time, right? Because your computer might switch off when you're at the D labs. And if you haven't saved on the T drive, if it switches off, you lose everything. You have to start from scratch, even though you're left, maybe you happen to be left with 20 minutes. So that's why it's important to always save here on the side. You see, it's here, there's a bit of yellow there and green. Green means those lines are saved. Yellow, this yellow, it means it's not saved. So you can go to file at the top and then click save file, or you can press Control S on your keyboard. So I'll press Control S on my keyboard, you see, saved. But then Control S only saves the changes I've made only within this file. If you look at how do I also know if the changes made in the file are not saved? It shows you what I call an asterisk at the top left corner of the file. You see, there's the asterisk here. It means whatever changes I've made inside main.cpp are not saved. You see here, they are not there. That means all these files changes are saved. So what I'm going to do is to save all of the changes made in all of the files. I think you can. Let me try. You can. I think it's Control Shift S. Let's see. Yeah. So you press Control Shift S to save all the changes made in all of the files in one time instead of going into one file at a time and save. So I've copied all the functions, and remember we promised in the header file that they will be implemented inside a namespace. So we put that namespace first. Then inside here, I paste all of those function prototypes. And then since there's implementations here that are expected, that means I'll replace all the semicolons here with curly braces because I want to provide implementation. I need to implement these functions, right? So this is how it looks, right, so far. And one thing you need to understand about, where is it? Yeah, one thing I need to understand, right? Every function that I declare in the header file first, right? and then I implement it here. I want it to be accessible inside the main.cpp. But if I only declare it inside the CPP file, that means I only wanted to use it within here. So for example, you see that I don't have a generate random function here. I'm going to create it here, and it's not declared in the header file. So don't try, if it's not declared in the header file, don't try to call it in the main. You won't find it. So be very careful of that. And then, okay, we're out of time, but then I can continue just a little bit, some functions that we know. We know that we need to be able to convert, we need to be able to generate random numbers in order to create the game mode. So I'm going to create a function called generate, okay, I'll call it create rand int. I just like that name. And since it creates an integer, we must get back an integer, right? It generates a random integer. Then I'm going to pass it const int reference. You should get used to it. So lower const int reference upper. And then we generate a range. I did explain a lot of this in other past papers, in other recordings. So I advise you to go watch those tonight and to end this weekend to catch up. And then I'm gonna return the rand function, which generates a random number. Then what's that word? I give that rand. Remember, the rand function returns a very random number. It can be 9 billion. It can be very big. So we need to mod it by the range or divide it by the range so that we limit it within a specific range. That's why we even call the variable range. So we're going to be limited within the specific range. But then if you leave it like this, it starts at 0 and stops before that number we're actually looking for. So you need to actually add back the lower bound to get it in between those exact code, those exact bounds, which is lower and upper. And then that's our random function. Then here, I'll just quickly type this, then we stop the session. So here we're going to create a game mode because this function is supposed to return something of type game mode. Then we know at the end of the day we need to return that game mode, so return record. And then here we need to initialize to set it to the, remember all of these parameters we're passing in, they're declared inside the enum, not the enum, the record structure. So we need to initialize those variables inside the record structure. So remember talked about record structures. You need to start by you specify the name of the record structure or the name of the record, followed by a dot, meaning go inside of that record and get that variable. In this case, we want to initialize rows to be those rows. This is the rows that is passed as a parameter. And then record.calls is equals to those calls, and then record dot has won. Obviously, you can start by winning. So I'm going to initialize it to false, which is okay. To be honest, I think you need two variables here. Yeah, I think you need two variables. Yeah, it's fine. But we'll see it in the next session. I'm thinking about the has one part, you might have issues there. Yeah, we have number of food sources. We need to initialize to that parameter number of food sources. Number of food sources. Yeah, that's a very long name. That's why we shouldn't use very long variable names. You see the problem? You're gonna have to type a lot. Number of ends, we initialize it to the number of ends we get from the user. Right, then we also need to allocate memory and things like that. Yeah, so that's it for today. I'll just stop here because I need to attend to ComSci 2A students. And yeah, the brain, if you do your research, right, the brain can only focus within the first 30 to 45 minutes. So I don't want to push you guys too much. You can go catch up on the recordings if you are still behind. That's your homework. And I know a lot of you are still behind. Go catch up on the recordings. Watch everything. Don't fast forward. You fast forward, they'll also fast forward your marks. So don't do that to yourself. Like I said, Dr. Stung is not one to be played with. He reads the textbooks. So yeah, you better go make sure you study. So that's it for today. See you tomorrow. We'll continue where we left off. Hope you guys have a lovely evening. If you have any questions, you can just post them on the group. Nah?